Um, hi everyone. My name is Emma Nickelbine. I'm the science communication intern, and I'm also a third year PhD student at UWM in the literature and cultural theory program. And my focus and the thing that I kind of want to talk to you guys about today is the arboreal humanities. Um, and also, just for context, you guys probably remember me talking to you about trees at some point this summer. My intern project was the community tree herbarium, which I'm going to be finishing up today. So if anyone wants to know how that turned out, it's at RP in the animal room. Um, but today, since I'm a graduate student and I'm in a field that a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, I thought it would be kind of fun to tell you a little bit about the arboreal humanities. So I'll give a little intro, letting you guys know what it is, what it's all about, and I'll give you just brief little tastes of a few of my ongoing projects in graduate school right now. So, slide, please. So I thought we'd start with just an intro to what the arboreal humanities even is. Like Maggie mentioned, like I mentioned, this is a really new field in academia right now. So we have the environmental humanities already, which is dealing with anything in the humanities that is interested in the environment or takes the environment as its like main topic. The arboreal humanities is something that me and a group of other professors and graduate students are proposing as like a little community within the environmental humanities. So currently our little group contains professors and graduate students from all over the US and a few places around the world who are interested in exploring trees from a humanities perspective. We're all interested for different reasons and in different forms of tree-related humanities exploration. But we're kind of united in our interest in trees and the effects that they have on humans. Because it's well documented scientifically that trees have effects on humans. We're really familiar with talking about them providing resources, providing food, building materials, medicines, carbon sequestration, habitat for wildlife, things like that. But what's less understood and in general less studied is the role of trees in our mental or cultural lives. So the way that we think about them and the effects of that on our thinking, our perception, our decision making, even our understanding of how the world works. So there are a lot of studies that talk about trees in relation to mental health and things like that. But I'm also really interested in how trees affect the way that we are perceiving our world, despite the fact that they're all around us all the time. So tree is really often something that kind of gets relegated to the background. We're so used to seeing them everywhere that we don't quite always clock and pay attention to them. And that's another reason that I'm doing projects like the ones I'm about to share with you, because I think once we start paying attention to trees, how we talk about them, how we write about them, we end up learning some really interesting things about ourselves as well. So I've just put up a list here of some of the different art forms that various people in the arboreal humanities are working on right now. I usually sit in the literature realm, but I'm also going to talk today about a podcast as well. So we've got like lots of different things. I know other people who are interested in art, film, music, history, all of these different genres that are kind of developing tree focuses over the past few years. Slide, please. So this movement is partially inspired by what I would consider like an entire renaissance of arboreal literature that's happening right now. So I've included a couple examples on the slide. If you haven't read anything about trees, but you might want to dip your toes into it, now is a great time to start because so many people are writing about trees right now that like we're just continually getting more and more cool books about trees in all different types of genres. So some of the ones on the slide are fiction, some of them are like scientific books explaining how trees work. I've got a work of poetry on here. I've got all sorts of stuff on the slide. But one thing that's really important to notice about this mix is that it can teach us not only how trees operate in their own tree societies, but also how trees operate in our societies. So that's why I tend to focus on fiction because I feel like that's a little bit less explored than some of the scientific avenues, but it can still tell us a lot about how we define our relationship to trees and kind of the things that are coming out of that relationship. So a couple highlights from this list, Suzanne Simard, if you haven't read Finding the Mother Tree yet, Suzanne Simard is the scientist that's often credited with being the first to write about mycorrhizal networks, connecting trees and trees being able to send nutrients and things along those networks. So she wrote a really incredible memoir about her experiences, which is quite good. And you know, there's a lot of good fiction on here that really challenges our perception of what we can do with a novel and how we can make our writing more arboreal. So Richard Powers in The Overstory kind of structures his novel as a tree. The different sections are called like root, trunk, crown, seeds. Like that's how he does it. Elif Shafak, The Island of Missing Trees, that actually has a human narrator and a tree narrator, which is kind of a fun way to do it. The tree knows a lot of information that the human narrator doesn't know, and that can kind of shift our perceptions of what trees are capable of. So the work that I'm going to talk about today, the three pieces, are fictional works. They include trees as major characters and agential beings in the plot, and sometimes in ways that are like really brazen, really purposeful, and others in ways that are a lot more subtle. Slide, please. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a project that I presented at a conference in Germany over the summer. And this conference was entirely dedicated to developing the arboreal humanities, figuring out what it means, and establishing it as its own field. So this project is actually about Moby-Dick by Herman Melville, which is a really famous novel. And as you can see, all my titles have quotes from the work of literature, the work of fiction in them, to kind of highlight the arboreal language that's happening right away. But I do want to point out really quickly that you do not have to have read Moby-Dick in any way to understand what I'm about to tell you. It's okay if you haven't read it. It is very long. It's hard to get into. I respect that completely. But I think we do have some interesting things going on in it that are worth talking about because this is a book that takes place entirely on the ocean. And every time I tell people I'm writing about trees in Moby-Dick, they think I'm insane. Basically, for those of you who aren't familiar, Moby-Dick is the story of a man named Ishmael who signs on to work on a whaling ship with Captain Ahab, who I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. He's basically a monomaniac. He's constantly seeking to kill the white whale, Moby-Dick, mostly because the whale bit off his leg. So slide, please. So one of the things that I really thought was interesting when I read this book last fall is that Melville's language is so focused on trees. The quote I have up on the slide is actually Ishmael talking about the novel, the book that he is writing while he's trying to tell this story about this whaling ship. And lo and behold, we've got trees already. He says, out of the trunk the branches grow, out of them the twigs, so in productive subjects come the chapters, right? So even right off the bat, just talking about the book Melville is constructing it against the image of a tree and kind of merging them together, suggesting that these are similar. Um, so if this were the only instance of arboreal language, right, it probably wouldn't be very convincing. But in particular, what Melville does is he characterizes Ahab using tree language, which I think is really interesting. He does this a lot throughout the novel, and we can really see it come through clearly in a couple of quotes. So I'm just going to throw them up on the next slide for you guys to take a look at here. So this one is in relation to Ahab's first appearance in the book. This is how we get introduced to Ahab. And we're talking about the scar. He's got this scar that runs down his whole body. Everyone's very mystified by it. But rather than just saying, like, this dude has this scar, Melville decides to describe it as a scar in a tree. So he says that the scar looks like the straight, lofty trunk of a great tree that's been cut down by like lightning. Lightning darts through it and leaves the tree. It's alive, but it's, branded. It's got that scar. And when we encounter Ahab, this being the first image that we get, I think is really important. Because this description connects Ahab's scar really directly to a very similar experiential image that's filtered through the lens and the experience of a tree. So rather than being asked to imagine this mark only from like a human perspective, we see it on another life form first to get a sense of that permanence, the severity of this thing for Ahab through the tree. And at other moments related to Ahab's like madness, his struggles throughout the book, Melville likes to say that he's shut up in the caved trunk of his body, that there's something holding him inside his body, which is, of course, the trunk of a tree, right? So on the next slide, we can see another really good example of some of this arboreal language really shaping how we see Ahab in the novel. So this one happens, there's a giant storm on the ship. Everyone's rushing around, they're afraid for their lives, and Ahab, rather than trying to make everyone feel better, he basically says that they're all stuck here, they have pledged themselves to his service, and that they have to help him kill the white whale, even if it means everyone dies too. And then this is the description we get immediately after he makes that statement. As in the hurricane that sweeps the plain, men fly the neighborhood of some lone gigantic elm, whose very heightened strength but render it so much the more unsafe, because so much the more a mark for thunderbolts. So at these last words of Ahab's, many of the mariners did run from him in a terror of dismay. And so, like, when we look at this, basically, Ahab is one of those giant trees that sits alone in a field, and everyone needs to get out of there if there is thunder and lightning happening in a field, because that is where the lightning is going to strike. So when we see Ahab being mentioned in this way, first of all, we can picture exactly what Melville's talking about here. And the average reader in the 1800s, when this would have come out, would know exactly, would have this image like locked and loaded, ready. Elms were a really, really popular field tree at that time. And actually some of the only big elms that we currently have surviving in the world are the ones that are alone in a field like that, because it's harder for them to be exposed to Dutch elm disease if they're alone all by themselves with nothing else around them. So on the next slide, I made a pretty interesting discovery when I was digging into some of my historical research about Melville. So he had a farm called Arrowhead in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s while he was writing Moby-Dick. And while exploring photos from the property circa 1870, I ran across this one showing a lone elm standing in a field at a place on the farm really near to the house where Melville was living at the time. So while the existence of a real tree to inspire his simile in the previous quotation doesn't necessarily make a difference to the plot of the novel, it can give us a real glimpse at the impact of trees on Melville's construction of these descriptions of Ahab. Basically, what this means is that if he looked at this tree and saw something that reminded him of Ahab, or alternately, if he thought of Ahab and could only describe this complexity going on with tree imagery, it means that trees are providing him with an important interpretive link that he uses to kind of bridge gaps between those really difficult conceptions that we have to grapple with in the novel, like obsession, madness, mental health in general. And Melville's using the tree as kind of a filter, a lens to be able to deal with those things productively without necessarily just dictating what you should think about the character at a particular moment. And on the next slide, I made another interesting historical discovery in terms of Melville himself. I ran across a couple of letters that some of his friends wrote about Melville, in particular about going to visit him on his farm. Monsell Field wrote in around the 1870s that Melville would take his friends to go visit trees on his property. That was what he liked to do when friends came over. And he would apparently tell his friends, like, oh, yes, I like to come to this particular spot and I like to pat the trees on the back. And that is the exact language that he used. And Field, his friend, was really impressed by Melville's identification with the trees in that way, the actual act of patting them on the back as a real equalizer, like seeing them as a being that deserves that kind of respect and attention. And that's something that not everyone was writing about at that time. It was not yet in fashion to be writing about like dealing with non-humans in that way. So I think this is a potential important link to understanding how Melville's talking about trees in the novel, because he did this in real life too. He seems to have really felt a connection with trees, and that affects how he moves throughout the world, what he does with his friends, what he tells people. And I think that matters, right? He's familiar with trees. He's using them to help explain all these difficult concepts that he has to come across in his novel. And I think if trees make it easier for him to articulate some of that stuff, it's really worth studying. So in the actual paper here, I also dissect some examples of how he talks about the ship, the whaling ship, in arboreal terms. And also how he talks about the whales also as arboreal beings. He has a lot of descriptions of the whales as trees in the same way that he describes Ahab as a tree. But in the interest of time and giving you guys a little like sampling of a few of the different things I'm doing, I'm going to shift to another project of mine on the next slide about a much more recent book. So this book is called Appleseed by Matt Bell. It's like I said, a few years ago, pretty recent sci-fi novel that's really spreading and expansive as far as scope and timescale. So if we take a look at the next slide here, I've just kind of laid out, basically, there's 3 time periods going on in this book with 3 different characters that kind of lead each time period. And from what we know from studying science fiction, it's important to remember that science fiction is not meant to be a prediction of what the future is going to be like. Science fiction is always a critique of the present, of things that are happening now, just in a literary form and in a fiction form. So this book takes 3 separate time periods and plays with the story of Johnny Appleseed in a really weird and very interesting way. So the first time period is colonial settlement of the United States. And the Johnny Appleseed character of the book is named Chapman, which is, fun in itself because Johnny Appleseed's real name was John Chapman. But in this book, Chapman is a faun, so a half human, half goat creature, who's going across the Midwest with his human brother, planting groves of apple trees as they go, and searching for what he calls the tree of forgetting because he wants to forget that he's a faun and he's different. But it's really interesting how connected this is to the real story of Johnny Appleseed, because most people don't actually know all the things that were going up with him. He was a wild dude, but he is also really often kind of lauded for planting apples everywhere and being so incredibly altruistic, when in reality, what was likely going on is that laws in Ohio at that particular point of settlement said that if you wanted to claim ownership to a piece of land, you had to improve upon it. And in that particular state, the way that you could improve the land enough to own it was to plant fruit trees on it. So the law said you had to plant something like between 20 and 30 fruit trees on a property for it to be claimed as yours. So very likely, Johnny Appleseed was actually planting trees in areas where he thought people would need them later to prove their ownership of land. So it was a little bit more of a economic scheme. He would go into an area that he thought was going to be settled, he would plant a bunch of trees, and then 10 years later, he would come back and sell them to the people who were settling the area. And that kind of matters for how the rest of the novel works. So the second time period is a near future to right now kind of moment, when climate change and poor agricultural practices have made it really difficult for people to get food. And there's a corporation that a character named John is trying to fight against because he used to be creating biotechnology for this corporation, including some super trees, which are basically apple trees that no longer really look like apple trees anymore. Their bark is black. They're really, really, really tall, and the apples are humongous, due to all the genetic manipulation. And this character also struggles with basically a machine called the loom, which, for lack of a better way to say it, is like a 3D printer for organic material and living beings. So if anyone happens to be interested in weird technological stuff, this is the book for you. Because then in the distant future, there has been some sort of glacial apocalypse. Very few things are left on Earth. And a character named C433 is a cyborg made of organic and plastic parts. And we discover he's actually using the loom, the 3D printer of organic material, to create his body over and over again. But when he does that in this book, he ends up grafting a tree's DNA onto his own, and he starts to turn into a tree throughout the course of the book. So if we go to the next slide, my interest in this book has a lot to do with apples. So we see them as really, really commonplace fruits, but they're actually really interesting in terms of how they work for the plant. So we're used to being able to find whatever variety of apple we want at the store. And really frequently we see the same ones coming up over and over again, right? Granny Smith, Red Delicious, all those different kinds that we're really used to seeing everywhere. But the process of growing them is actually a lot different than other fruits and vegetables. So an apple will contain 5 or 6 seeds usually, all of those seeds are genetically distinct from the parent tree. So what that means is if I have a Granny Smith apple tree and I want to propagate another apple tree from it, I can't use the seeds because each of those seeds is no longer a Granny Smith apple. It will not taste or look the same. It will be its own genetically distinct, unique variety of apple. And just, for fun, I think it's great to know that these seedlings, if you grow an apple seed, they're called wildlings, which is just adorable in my opinion. But this means that when you say toss out an apple core when you're done eating an apple, you toss out 5 or 6 totally unique, distinct varieties of apple that didn't exist before and will never exist again, which is kind of wild to think about. Now, I should mention most apple varieties that are propagated from seed are not actually that pleasant for humans to eat. They're usually really bitter. Some of them have really thick skins. Some of them are even difficult to bite through. But over time, people have found varieties of apple that they really liked, and figured out how to preserve them in a process called grafting. So some of us are probably familiar with this. Basically, you take a cutting from the parent tree whose fruit you really like, and you position it on a cut from a rootstock, which can be any apple you want, even if it doesn't taste good. And you take the cuts, put them together, and bind those two together really firmly. And the cuttings will actually grow together as part of their healing process and create a new tree that will give you the fruit of the tree that you took the cutting from. So that's how we get all of the apples in our grocery stores all the time. They are grafted, and that's how we know that they're that particular variety. So that means that you can go to the store, you can find, say, a Macintosh apple, and that apple can usually be traced directly back to the exact person who first grafted that variety onto another tree, which is pretty cool to think about. Now, Johnny Appleseed did not like grafting. It is recorded that he thought this was a violence against the tree. He thought that that was not how the tree would have wanted to do things. And he said that he would only plant apples from seed. So now you'll remember that, like, we've got this altruistic view of him spreading food all over the Midwest. But it was very likely that the apples he planted were not actually good for human consumption, just straight up. So what people would do with them is they would make apple cider with them. So he should actually probably be more credited with spreading the potentiality to make alcohol across the Midwest versus eating apples. So if we can go to the next slide, Matt Bell's book takes grafting and all of this human meddling, if you will, in the lives of apples, and plays with it in terms of modern technologies. So the character John is speaking in this quote on the slide. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but basically he realizes that by creating these super trees, he has turned apples into only a product that he believes he has pushed too far, that it is no longer an apple and is instead some sort of like mockery of what an apple had come to be over like thousands of years of human interaction. And he's really troubled by it because he realizes that in a generation or two from his existence, there won't be anyone who remembers what apples used to taste like. They'll only remember his super tree apples. And as we go on to the next slide, we can tell that the novel is playing with the idea of an apple tree having some sort of agency or ability to kind of write its own story, because we have John having those thoughts in an earlier timeline, leading to C433, who is just completely consumed by a tree over the course of the book, to the point where he like starts to not be able to move his limbs, and he starts to like have trouble walking, but he's so fascinated with the fact that he's turning into a tree, that instead of being upset about it. He seems to have like a real sense of love for the tree instead. He wants the tree to survive over himself. And the tree eventually just starts driving. C43 433 is still narrating the story, but he's fully acknowledging that, like, yeah, the tree wants to go over there, and so I'm just gonna go over there too. We're gonna go together and we're gonna figure out like how we can make this tree survive in this glacial landscape. Um, which I think is considerably interesting, just because of the legacy of apples. Because of humans, the apples have not necessarily had as much of an opportunity to do apple life the way that they traditionally would before humans came and meddled with them, but also the existence of an apple in today's world is really predicated on those human-tree relationships. So I don't think we can really have a situation where we're all apple agency or all human agency. We need that combination because we have grown up together for generations, and that's something that this book, I think, really shows us. So in the paper, I discuss a lot about the wild genetics of the apple, the things that it can do, and how those can be a form of vegetal agency. So humans have modified that agency, but in C's timeline, the tree kind of takes that back in the end. And I won't give away the end of the book in case anyone wants to dive into it. But it's weird, but it's pretty good. Okay, so if we go on to my next slide. So this project, I'm just going to talk about it super briefly. I'm going to kind of gloss it over because I know we're short on time. But if anyone, we can go to the next slide, has encountered before the Cryptonaturalist. It's a podcast by Jarod K. Anderson. And for a lot of us, podcasts are usually like factually based, right? We tune in and we learn about like fun science facts or things like that. But the Cryptonaturalist is a fiction podcast. It's got 63 episodes to date right now. And it follows the Cryptonaturalist, who's a character who studies the world's cryptids. So he studies fictional creatures in the podcast. But the slogan for this thing is real love for imaginary nature. So it walks this kind of fine line between like being totally fictional, but actually inspiring real life care and attention to nature that actually exists. So if we go to the next slide, the Cryptonaturalist deals a lot with trees that move. There's a lot of episodes in it where the cryptid that we're coming up against and learning about in the episode is some sort of tree-shaped being. And I just want to mention real quick that like this is a really common theme in literature, to have like horror or scary stories where trees are able to move, or they have faces, or they can speak, right? Because those are things we traditionally don't think that trees do, and so when we see them do it, it's scary. But I think it's worth it to just mention that trees, they don't move as individuals, but they do move as tree communities. So they can migrate over the course of generations. I'm not going to get into that too much because I know Tim did a really cool plant migration backyard naturalist a few weeks ago that covered a lot of that. So you can, go back to that or tune into your memories about that. But that's important to what I'm going to talk about here. So if we go to the next slide, just super briefly, the episode 50 of the podcast is called The Willow Man, and it's inspired by this Somerset folk song, Elm do grieve, oak he do hate, willow do walk, if you travels late. So initially this was supposed to describe the characteristics of different trees. It was said that an elm, if you cut down the one next to it, the other one that's still alive would wilt and grieve. Oak was said to take revenge upon you if you cut it down. And willow was said to follow travelers around if they were traveling late at night, and kind of speak or mutter to them. If we go to the next slide, that's what this episode is about. The cryptonaturalist goes to a recently cut down forest edge, and he is really quickly followed by a willow that mutters to him. And he deduces that the willow's angry about the deforestation. And this is what he does on this slide. He retrieves seedlings from his pocket and he goes through and plants them while he kind of talks to the willow a little bit about how sorry he is that the forest got cut down for farm field. And he really approaches this in a way that I think is quite cool, because the cryptonaturalist really specifically says he's not intending for the willow to forgive him. He doesn't think the willow should forgive humans for cutting down its friends. But he does say that the act that he wants to partake in is committing himself to the business of the forest while he's going to be in it. So that's the reason that he decides to deal with this moving tree differently. Instead of being afraid of it, he tries to communicate with it in this way. And this leads him to make the point on the last slide, which is my last point. I'm going to end with him. He says, just remember, when we seek to do better, don't look to the horizon, look to your own hands, to your words, to the small, intimate reality of you and your place and time. No, you may not be a thing that can move a mountain or build a forest, but I suspect you could very well be a thing that can plant a seed. Okay, so that's what I've got. If anyone has any questions, please feel free.